This is Lisa Ray with RJI. Today's podcast is for Bill Pelkey. We're meeting today with Pastor Jack Sullivan Jr., George White, and Abe Bonovitz. Today's podcast, though, is a tribute to our friend and colleague Bill Pelkey, who died on November 12th in Anchorage, Alaska. Bill was a victim of violent crime whose 78-year-old grandmother was brutally murdered in Gary, Indiana in 1985 by a group of juvenile girls. During an attempted home robbery, Paula Cooper stabbed Ruth Pelkey 33 times. Bill at first supported the death penalty for Paula Cooper, but later emphatically reversed that position and became a champion against its use. Bill and co-founder George White founded the Journey of Hope from Violence to Healing in the 1990s. So today we speak with, from Virginia, George White, who's the co-founder, as I said, of Journey of Hope. And George is also a victim of violent crime and an exoneree. And from Ohio, Pastor Jack Sullivan Jr., who's executive director of the Ohio Council of Churches and a victim of violent crime himself. And Jack sits on RJI's Global Advisory Council. And lastly, from Ohio, Abraham Bonovitz, director of Death Penalty Action, a longtime colleague of Bill's. So welcome to you all today.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Glad to be here.
Thanks so much. And I usually ask people how we met, but I'm going to reverse it and say, how did you meet Bill Pelkey? And so that first question is going to go, I'm going to ask you all that, but George, why don't you tell me how you met Bill?
Okay, well, Bob Gross, who is the volunteer executive director of the Journey of Hope now, he was the organizer for the first Journey of Hope held in Indiana in 1993. He came down to Alabama, where I was working as a mitigation specialist, talked with my boss, and then talked with me and invited me to come along on this first Journey of Hope that was being held. Bill had the initial inspiration for the Journey of Hope, and at that time it was sponsored by Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation. Reconciliation. I was somewhat surprised that there were people like me, murder victim family members, that opposed the death penalty. I went on that first journey. My son Tom accompanied me, and I met Bill Pelkey there, actually on a stairwell at a church in Michigan City. Bill became my friend, my mentor, my traveling buddy, and we've spoken together in more than 30 states and 10 countries. But that's how I met him on that first Journey of Hope.
Yeah, and George, how do you define the journey? I mean, what's it comprised of, in essence?
The journey, as Bill envisioned it, was to gather together murder victim family members, death row family members of those who have been executed, and other exonerees and others with stories to tell. We offer ourselves individually and organizationally to others in their work against the death penalty. We believe that the telling of stories is a powerful way to inform and to educate. We believe in public education. So a major journey is 2 weeks, 3 weekends in a state. And we speak in churches, in high schools, in colleges, social organizations, anywhere where we can get an invite and come in and share the stories which lead to dialogue, which we believe leads to public education.
Yes, yes. And Abe, how did you meet Bill?
Well, Bill and I have been trying to sort out exactly the first time that we met, but it could have been on the Lighting the Torch of Conscience March, which went from Stark, Florida to Atlanta, Georgia in 1990. I was down for the last couple of days of that, but Bill was on that whole event. So it's possible our paths crossed there. I know that the first time I remember seeing Bill, he was speaking at an Amnesty International conference and waving around a big Bible and which was kind of unusual on an Amnesty International conference. So, but then Bill became, he took a volunteer leadership position with Amnesty and became the state death penalty abolition coordinator for Amnesty International. And I was what we called an area coordinator in the next state over in Columbus, Ohio. So, it was just natural that we started connecting. And of course, I'm all about action and doing things, and we just started working together and organizing. I helped some of the organizing and outreach around that first Journey of Hope in 1993.
Okay, yeah. And how about you, Jack?
I met Bill late July 2015. I met him during my very first fast and vigil in Washington, D.C. I journeyed to that vigil as the executive director of Murder Victims Families for Reconciliation. And Bill told me who he was and gave me his story, both personally, and then I heard him present his story to the public. And I was just so impressed by who he was and his demeanor and his passion. And that it opened the door for us to have a long, long as 5 years can be, a friendship that was rich and meaningful and transformative in my life. And he became my mentor and my friend and my brother in this movement and beyond.
Yes, oh, that's wonderful. And let me just share my quick little story about Bill and how we met. And it's kind of like Abe. In that I can't totally remember exactly the year, but I was working for a group called Justice Fellowship in California, which focused on changing the criminal justice system to reflect restorative justice. And it was probably the late 1990s. And somehow I heard about Bill's story, and I'm not sure if somebody sent me a link to it or sent me an article, but I thought, oh my gosh, what, this is amazing. So I somehow got a hold of him and we talked on the phone, and in time, he was interested in the work that I was doing, and ended up on the board of a group that I started called the Justice and Reconciliation Project. He was on my board, and then I came on the board of the Journey for a period of time. But we realized there was quite an intersection between what he was doing with the death penalty and his story and restorative justice. And then later on, he sat on my Global Advisory Council at RJI. But it was such a privilege to learn about Bill's story, because at that, around 1999, I didn't know that many crime victims around the country that supported restorative justice and were victims of violent crime. So he was extraordinary. Let's talk about the mission of the Journey. And why don't you talk about that, George, a little bit, and then we'll go to Abe about the mission.
Okay, well, as I said before, we're about public education, and one of Bill's famous quotes is, if I can remember it right at the moment, love and compassion for all humanity is the answer, or the answer is love and compassion for all humanity. That's at the core of our message. Now, a lot of us have gotten to the point of forgiveness. However, forgiveness is not necessary in the whole process. It is about being opposed to the death penalty, and some of us are opposed on religious values, some are opposed on economic value, the whole gamut. But again, our mission is public education. We focus on getting the stories before people. We believe that it's about the power of the story. It's not about George White or Bill Pelkey as individuals. It's about the power of the story and getting those stories in front of people. We put real faces on real human experiences. And we have seen for close to 30 years now how those stories can have an impact. When we finish a talk, you may continue to disagree with our position, but you cannot dismiss the experience. And it is putting those experiences in front of people that is, in fact, our mission.
Right, right. So Abe, how would you respond to that? And maybe you can tell us a little bit more too about what you know about Bill Pelkey's faith.
Well, Bill Pelkey is, Jesus was his savior, but he was, he was the kind of Christian that was actually following the words of Jesus and living according to the tenets of the Sermon on the Mount, and love your neighbor, visit the prisoner, help people, be humble, all of those things. I don't remember ever hearing Bill say, "Well, it's Sunday morning, I got to go to church." Bill was church, and he was in church all the time. And it wasn't he was a member of the United Methodist Church congregation, but he grew up as a fundamentalist Baptist and graduated from a place called Hiles-Anderson Baptist Bible College. Bill liked to remind us that the speaker at his commencement was Jerry Falwell, and people thought he was too liberal. So, so there's that. As to the mission and the work, is that the other part of the question?
Let me also rephrase it. Why don't you tell us too about how he got the call per se? Because you tell that well.
To do this work?
Yes.
Okay, so so Paula Cooper was excuse me, Paula Cooper was convicted and sent to death row, and Bill initially supported that, as did his family. And Bill talked about this beautiful picture that he had of his grandmother, and after she had been murdered, every time he looked at that picture, he saw tears coming out of her eyes. And one day, sitting up at work, he was a steel worker. He operated an overhead crane, and he had some downtime, and he started reflecting on his grandmother, and he reflected on that picture, and he saw the tears coming out of her eyes, and he realized that those would not be tears of pain, but rather tears of compassion and love for this girl that had killed her, because his grandmother would not have wanted anybody to be killed in her name, especially a 15-year-old girl. And Bill didn't feel that compassion. So, believing in his grandmother's faith, and she was killed and targeted not because she was a Bible teacher, but because the girls knew that they could go to her and get Bible lessons, and so she'd be home and would open the door to them. That was the premise for the crime. But because she was so faithful, that was, Bill just said, somebody in his family should share that faith. And he, sitting on the crane that night, begged God to give him love and compassion for Paula Cooper. And with that, he would be able to forgive Paula. And as Bill would talk about it, he said then he suddenly started thinking about what he could do. He could write a letter to Paula. He could write a letter to the newspaper and explain, why he had changed his position. And he realized that his prayer for love and compassion had been answered, and he was able to forgive Paula Cooper. And he talked about the weight, the heaviness of, the hate that you need to want to kill somebody, lifting off of him. And he made God at that time, sitting in his crane still, two promises. One, that the honor and the glory, any honor and glory that would come as a result of forgiving Paula Cooper, would go to God. He's not taking that for himself. That's God's honor and glory, and he would always, pass that along. And the other promise, as Bill liked to say, was the one that got him in trouble. And that was, he made a promise to God that he would walk through any open door, any door that opened to him as a result of forgiving Paula Cooper. And as Bill liked to say it, if he had any idea what that would mean, that he would have been terrified, because, the next thing you know, he did write that letter to the editor. He did encounter neighbors. He talks about seeing a friend in a convenience store who said, "Hey, I hope that person fries." And Bill said, "Well, that's I don't." And then they got to have a conversation, and the guy realized, you're right. And that was and Bill emulated that Christian ethic of forgiveness. And so then he did write a letter to the newspaper. And then when Paula Cooper was taken off of death row, and even before then, this was big news around the world because, they're going to kill a 15-year-old. Newspaper reporters called the local paper and said, who should we talk to? And the editor said, well, the grandson wrote a letter forgiving her. You should call him. And that basically was the start of Bill being an international figure and a leading voice on the healing power of forgiveness and in opposition to the death penalty as a victim family member.
And didn't he also contact the Pope or try to? Or at least...
Well, what happened was, Bill was invited to Italy, and the initial visit was to be on a television program that was like a big talk show kind of format, and Bill flew to Italy, and then they were supposed to do the show, and there was a wildcat strike. The camera operators or somebody like that went on strike, and they said, well, we don't know how long this is going to last. You go home, we'll bring you back. And instead, Bill said, well, I don't have to be home. I got vacation time, I can stay. So he ended up staying something like more than 2 weeks. And what ended up happening is Father Vito, who, not Vito Corleone, but Father Vito, Father Vito was with this Italian organization that had come up in part because of Paula Cooper and the campaign that they had led to gather like 2 million signatures in a petition. And they just started speaking all over the place. And that was the beginning of Bill's speaking career.
That's wonderful. That's a great description of it too. And Jack, what do you want to add to this about, I kind of got off the question, but I was asking about the mission of the journey, and how do you see that?
Well, let me tell you, stories, as George has indicated, stories have such power. They have transformative properties, each story. And although I've heard Bill's story, George's, and others many, many times, I could probably recite them nearly word to word, word for word. I get something different out of each time I hear one of the stories. And my life is enriched a little bit more with each hearing. And we tell these stories wherever we are invited. And we have seen, in some cases, lives transformed, lives changed, or at least people were left with some food for thought. And if not by the stories, then by the people who they get to experience, who don't even say a word, but their stories speak for themselves. Like, for example, once during a fasting vigil, I gave my story about losing my sister to murder and why I was against the death penalty. And there was a person who heard the story in front of the Supreme Court. He was not moved at all by my story. He was very kind and polite, but not moved. And I said to him, well, if you are not moved by my story, I want you to meet a person who's on death row. And then exaggerated. Here's Sudra Graham right behind me.
Yes.
And he went over and talked to Sudra, and they had a long talk. And the person's daughter looked at me and smiled, as if to say her father was experiencing a change right then and there as he heard Sudra's story. So I'm just impressed by the power of stories. Now, Bill, as a Christian, it's important for people to understand that there are many, many types of Christians. And among them are people who pride themselves on getting non-believers into heaven, on getting people into heaven. And then there are people like Bill who try their best to get heaven into people. And I have just found that so much more impact occurs through the ministry of people who try to get heaven into people than any other brand or style or orientation to this faith that I've noticed. And when you hear Bill speak about love and compassion, about forgiveness, I mean, those are three elements that human beings need, no matter what their faith orientation happens to be, or no faith at all. We all need love, we all need compassion, and we all need forgiveness. whether we admit it or not. And there are some among us who don't admit that they need forgiveness, but we all really
Yes.
do need forgiveness. And so these stories, especially as articulated by Bill over the years that I've known him, and I said 5 years, seemed like so much longer, but they're just 5 years. But those stories carry weight and power. And I believe God is at work through those stories, changing lives, changing hearts, changing
Yes.
minds.
Yes. And you know, a lot of people that are part of RJI are people of faith. Not everybody, but a lot. But they're drawn by the message of restorative justice, the hope for healing of victims of crime and transformation of offenders. But so also let's talk about what do you think is the most important part? We've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'll ask Abe, what do you think is the most important part of the journey, of a journey event, maybe? Abe?
Well, yes. So that's sort of, I like I like to look at any kind of direct action and active and such activity as both internal and external. Internally, it's like group therapy. It's we all come together, and you have victim family members and death row family members and the families of people they executed and exonerees and activists, and we all get to be friends and work together and struggle together sometimes and be
Right.
forgiving of each other. But basically, when we come together, it's nourishing. It's exhausting too, because the work, like George is a good example. He's like a barometer. He tells his story and you can tell how draining it is for one of these people to put themselves back in a place where the worst thing that ever could have happened to a person happened, either to them, or in George's case, he was a victim in the same crime and his wife was killed, or to somebody. I mean, even myself, I tell my story a few times and you get tired, but anyway, you can see that draining, and then we get to come together and be together. And it's one of the hardest things is leaving when
Yes,
we've
yes.
been working together like this. So that's the internal part. And the same is true, Jack mentioned the fast and vigil to abolish the death penalty, the annual starving for justice.
And that's always in Washington, D.C.
But it came about in part because there was a recognition of these two anniversaries. June 29th, 1972 is the anniversary of the Furman decision by the US Supreme Court, which struck down all the death penalty laws in the country, forcing states that wanted to have a death penalty to write new laws. And then July 2nd, 4 years later, 1976, the new laws finally made their way up to Supreme Court scrutiny and were upheld. And that allowed the resumption of executions. So Bill and Rick Halpern and Marietta Yeager, and I think there was one other person involved, but it's Bill and Marietta and Rick are commonly understood to be the co-founders of both the Abolitionist Action Committee and the annual Fast and Vigil to abolish the death penalty, which this year will be the 28th year. And this past year, Bill actually, he risked COVID, he dodged COVID, made sure that he was in Washington, D.C., even though we told people not to come. And we did all the programming remotely with a really skeleton crew just to have that presence. In any case, that too is, people say, why are you doing that? The Supreme Court isn't even going to hear your message. And it's for us, every bit as much as it is for the people that might see us. Anyway, so that's the internal purpose and impact of the journey of hope from violence to healing. The external part is, the journey of hope is now the only organization led by murder victim family members who oppose the death penalty that is still standing. It was born out as a project of Murder Victim Families for Reconciliation, which doesn't exist anymore. And that organization at one point split, and a lot of people went and formed another organization called Murder Victim Families for Human Rights, which also doesn't really function as an organization all the time, although there are still people that identify with both of those organizations. Try to find either one on the internet, you can't, but the journey you can find. And that's the good news here about Bill's vision is, just to take it to the next step is that Bill recognized that he wasn't going to be around forever. He wasn't looking to check out, but he recognized that it was time for new leadership, and also to make sure that there was leadership present. That and Bill and George and Jack are both, I think, still on the board of the Journey of Hope, but Bill stepped away, took a sabbatical, starting almost a year ago now, stepping away from any decision making having to do with the journey. And because often when Bill's in the room, nobody wants to go against Bill. and although that's happened, people get to have those hard conversations. But Bill's the first one to pull out his credit card and say, the money will come. I'm going to put it up front. That sort. So
right,
now
and he'll always say, "I have the mileage for you to get you there." Right.
Exactly. So the point being that Bill recognized the need to make sure that the journey of hope from violence to healing had legs of its own that didn't require him, and stepped away to force that hand, which is what happened. He brought in Bob Gross, who's an outstanding facilitator and thinker and planner and very cautious in his moves. And he has guided that board process. I think that's a fair way. I'm not at that table at this point, but what I can say is that there's stability and there's capacity, and we're all looking forward to hearing what's the next thing that the journey is going to do, beyond saying, okay, we're going to be a part of something, which actually exciting. Next week, December 6th to the 12th, we're doing a conference. It's a virtual conference, but it's in honor and in memory of Bill Pelkey. The conference is it's a human rights crisis, U.S. federal execution spree virtual conference, and it's going to be online. Details about it at deathpenaltyaction.org and on the Journey Facebook page and other Facebook pages. And people can attend, and there'll be some reflection on Bill. It's not about Bill, but we're inspired by Bill.
Yeah.
That's the key thing.
Okay. Well, George, I want to get you back in this. You haven't really told us your story. And even though I want to point out to people who are listening, in 2017, we did a podcast with you, George, and with Bill. So
Right.
I'm thankful that got recorded, and we're going to put that one up again, because there you are with Bill. But George, why don't you briefly tell your story, since stories are such a part of the journey and the foundation of it.
Okay, well, I'll try to be very brief. In February 27, 1985, I was married. My wife, Charlene, I called her Char. We had two small children. My son, Tom, was 12, and daughter, Christy, 5. We were living our little piece of the American dream in Enterprise, Alabama. I was vice president of an independent chain of building supplies. In response to a phone call from a customer who needed an emergency supply, Char and I went out to the store. The kids were spending the night with their grandmother. We got there. We were there maybe 5 minutes, knock at the door. We were confronted by a man with a gun. Opened a safe, gave him what was there, gave him my wallet. Char gave him her purse. Then he told us to go out there, and he gestured to the showroom where the cash registers were. I knew there wasn't money in their cash registers, but he had the gun. As we started out, Char was beside me. He was a little bit behind. I turned to push open the door. Char stumbled. The first shot was fired. 6 shots were fired. Char was struck twice. 1 missed. I was struck 3 times. Char literally died in my arms. For my kids and I and our family, that was just the beginning of the nightmare. Obviously, I lived. 16 months later, unbelievably to me, I was indicted, arrested, and charged with the capital murder of my wife. Hired a lawyer, a country lawyer by the name of Paul Young. Alabama didn't have public defenders, but I'd known Paul. He was then appointed to represent me. Following a 2-week trial, 16 months later, or 14 months later, I was convicted. I faced the death penalty. However, I received a sentence of life. I spent 2 years, 103 days in prison. And then the conviction was overturned. I was released. Then it took 3 more years, and through the efforts of Paul Young and others, they uncovered the evidence that absolutely proved my innocence. That's the short version. Now, during all of that, in my heart and in my head, I was filled with anger, with hatred, with a desire for revenge and retribution. Not all murder victim families go to hatred, but I certainly did. But I came to understand, and it took several years, that it wasn't hatred that sustained me, it was love. It was a love of a God that I had cursed. It was the love of my children, who are the beauty part of the story. They had lost their mother, and they had the state of Alabama say, your daddy did it. But their response was to keep on loving me. That's the short version. I can go on for hours, obviously. But through the journey, as Jack pointed out, we have our opportunity. And as Abe pointed out, it is kind of therapeutic to talk about
Absolutely.
those things with people and to share that we are human beings. I don't want to be dismissed as a saint. I am not a saint. I'm in that category of striving to be heavenly perfect. And some days I go forward and some days I go back.
Right.
But through the journey, I have found a purpose to help keep the memory of my wife alive. Charlene White loved life. We want that to be her legacy.
Yes, that's wonderful, George. And, you know, RJI does a lot of work with exonerees. And it's really, I have to tell this story because if it weren't for Bill Pelkey, I don't think that my work would have gone down that road. So whenever the journey went to Texas, I think it was 1999. Abe, is that right? Was that, is that the Texas event?
The first Texas journey was 1998.
Okay, so I was at that one, and actually I had been asked by Bill twice to go on a journey event, and I remember saying to him, I'm not sure what I do there. And I wanted him to know that I didn't like to have a lot of time on my hands where I didn't know that I had a purpose at an event. So I said no the first time, and then he came back around and asked me again, and I said, well, can you put me, you know, on the agenda where I have a little bit of time to speak about restorative justice? And he said, yeah, we can do that. And Sister Helen Prejean was at that event, and I had heard a lot about her and seen her, you know, on television and so forth. And I had no idea that I was going to be at an event where she was speaking. And I was in the audience, and I actually asked her a question, and I wanted to talk about restorative justice and the death penalty. And Sister Helen had me come up and speak a little bit, which was really Bill's idea. So that was an incredible blessing to me. And he took a photo, which I put up on Facebook now and then. But also what I realized, like you all are saying, is that it really wasn't about hearing the speeches, although all the speeches that I did hear were really important, but it was about being with the people that were in the journey. And I met exonerees, including Greg Wilhoit. And Greg, who's now gone, had a huge impact on my work since he was on death row in Oklahoma. And I got to know him and got to know his family. And I actually was with him at his latter days in Sacramento. And that was Bill Pelkey. In fact, Greg was in the hospital, and he called me from Alaska, and he said, Lisa, you're pretty close to where Greg is, and he's in the hospital. Can you go down there? And I said, I'll be there. And man, that had an effect on my work and seeing the connection between the death penalty, restorative justice, and wrongful convictions as well. So let me go on and ask a few more questions. We're kind of touching on this quite a bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper. I want to talk, and maybe I'll ask you, Jack, I want to talk about Paula Cooper a little bit more. What a lot of the people that are listening and watching this don't know is that Paula Cooper and Bill Pelkey became pretty close. And I don't know how much you know about that, Jack, but I want you to talk about forgiveness and what Bill went through to forgive Paula Cooper specifically, and also about the end of her life. Jack, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I can just say that I believe in the power of forgiveness. I believe that there are properties available for the person who is being forgiven, and yet there are properties that are often hidden from sight available to the one who's offering their forgiveness, meaning that that person does not have to carry the weight, some say even the poison or the toxin of unforgiveness, of unresolved anger with them for the duration of their lives. When they forgive a person who has hurt them, they're able to release that and move forward. And some people believe that's when the restoration of people's lives begins, when they are able to actually forgive someone who has done them or their families a harm. And I believe that Bill reached that place. Not everybody can or will, but he reached it. And I was so glad he talked about it, because it made people understand that they need not carry the weight of their brokenness around with them forever. They can use their story to help transform people's lives and change policies around them. And so I was just grateful to hear Bill speak about forgiveness, because I was becoming more and more aware of the importance of that power being released into the universe. Whenever Bill told his story, I can only imagine that it must have been transformative in many respects for Paula Cooper, to know that the person whose grandmother she killed had the audacity, the strength, the fortitude to forgive her, and therefore not continue that cycle of violence, even though he had every right to do so if he wanted to do so. So it takes strength and courage to forgive. And both of those gifts were embodied in our brother Bill.
Yeah, and maybe I'll ask either one of you, George or Abe, about Paula Cooper, though, that the fact that, I mean, she was the one who stabbed his grandmother 33 times. And when we hear that, it's just, I don't know how many times you hear the story, you're just staggered by it. I mean, the act was brutal, but at the same time, he was able to say later in his life that he loved Paula Cooper. And I remember reading an article, and we probably posted it, but he was involved in restorative justice work, and he said, I want to restore Paula Cooper when she's released. And I thought, well, that's a different spin on it. Restore Paula Cooper, not that he was looking for restorative justice for himself. He was talking about restoring her. So George, do you have any comments about that? And then we'll go to Abe.
Sure. For several years, Bill attempted to visit Paula, but Indiana, very archaic, very draconian, would not let him go in and visit Paula. During all those years, he wrote her and they exchanged correspondence and what have you. And then I should know, but I think it was about like 9 years, he finally got to go to visit Paula.
Yes.
And he talked about that when giving his talks. Leaving that first visit, he said, as he was driving home, the thought that kept going across his head was wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. He had been able to sit with the girl that had brutally murdered Nana, his grandmother that he loved with his whole heart, and yet not feel an ounce of desire for revenge or retribution. Bill had hoped, of course, then when Paula was paroled, she was prevented for 2 years from contacting any of the family. Bill couldn't see her. And it was just a few weeks before she would have been. And Bill wanted to be able to go and have Paula join us on a journey and go and share. But to our great regret, Paula was ultimately unable to forgive herself, and she committed suicide.
Yes.
It broke Bill's heart. I was living in Indiana at the time, and I went with Bill to the memorial service and what have you. But Bill has met Paula's sister at that private service, And Rhonda joined us in Ohio for the journey there, and has since become a regular contact among Journey folks. We've all fallen in love with her, and she has opened up to us, and that was all because of Bill.
Yeah. And Abe, do you have any comments about this, about Paula Cooper and Bill?
Well, I think it's a hard thing for people to understand, forgiving the killer of your loved one. And in fact, it's a harder thing for people to understand, not just forgiving them, but helping them.
Yes.
You know, in 1998, right at the beginning of 1998, when I was the organizer for the Texas journey in 1998. Well, first, I went to Indiana and actually moved into Bill's house with him. We were going to spend a couple of months working there. And right about that time, Bill had been on a program with Suzanne Bosler and Marietta Yeager, I think, and somebody, Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People, right? And the program was Sally Jesse Raphael. And even she just sort of ambushed them. There was a moment at the end of the program where all four of them are grouped together as Sally Jesse Raphael tells them how she couldn't understand or believe it, and really ambushed them. Bill came home from that recording and just was so miserable because of how that had been played. But for him, it was never a question. And this is the thing that we really can see. We had a couple of gatherings by Zoom right after Bill died for those of us to just get together and process. And one of the people that came out of that first call towards the end, a woman named Joteka Edie, has known Bill for over 20 years. She was a young organizer, a young Black woman from a small town in South Carolina. And she just described how unbelievable it was to Bill and to her that here this white steel worker, fundamentalist Christian from Indiana was actually putting himself out there for a Black girl who, I mean, even today, these people are dismissed. Black, poor, uneducated, drug addicted, whatever, they're easily dismissed. And for somebody to step up and stand up for her. And that's what we've seen repeatedly is, the last execution that Bill was at, if I recall correctly, was of Christopher Villalba. And the morning of that execution in Terre Haute, Indiana, we had a press conference, and really Christopher's mother came, and that was unexpected, but she came and she ended up being the primary voice in that press conference. And Bill was standing behind her. He did not need to be speaking. He was there to support. And you can see that with Ken and Lois Robinson and their son executed in Texas. And he's been doing a lot of work with the Rodney Reed case with Roderick and Juana, traveling around the country, making sure that to lift them up. That's really where Bill's passion was in not wanting to see the pain put to anybody else's family, but in particular the families of those on death row.
Yeah. I wanted to remember something, and I think it was in the film that Mickey Dickorf, is that the name,
Yes.
pronunciation? And that film was it just called The Journey? Or I don't remember the name.
Oh, gosh.
We can find it and we'll put up a link. But it was really great to watch it because the footage was just so complete. There was so much footage of your journey events. And I just remember one little piece, and because I didn't see it except watching it through film, but it had, I think, Marietta Yeager, who, again, Marietta Yeager, her daughter was abducted and killed, right? Young daughter in Montana. And I believe it was just Bill and Marietta. They were on the air, and I think it was a Christian radio show, and they were taking some particularly difficult calls. And I remember thinking to myself, and because I've done a lot of work nationally and in California around restorative justice, and those are people of faith. And I realized that in my own life, I sometimes have heard some really tough questions coming from people of faith, questioning the work. And I always think, why are we getting the toughest questions from those people? Well, that's what I saw that day in that film. And somebody was just getting very angry at them for taking the position that they were taking on the death penalty. And I was thinking how sad, you know, when crime victims or victims of violent crime take the positions that that so many of those are active in the movement, your movement, and in restorative justice, that they receive the scorn from people, which instead they should be embraced for the, you know, the audacity of taking the position they do. Right?
Yep.
Anyone have a comment on that?
Not being Christian, I could leave that to the other two.
Yeah, and
But
that could be anybody of faith.
Right, but what I would say is that you know, Bill and Marietta, Suzanne, George, and many others, Jack, and all that. I mean, they're living according to the teachings of Jesus, the actual what Jesus taught. Bill always talked about forgiveness as something that Jesus taught, and how,
Yes.
you know, when Jesus was asked how many times are we supposed to forgive, 7 times or 70 times, and Jesus said 70 times 7, and Bill would always add to that, and that didn't mean that on the 491st time you're supposed to stop forgiving.
Right.
Forgiveness is supposed to be a way of life,
Right.
and people just can't grasp it.
Right. That's right.
Because they haven't experienced it.
Yes.
And it's counter to what the Bible thumpers like to say, well, the death penalty is, you know, the Bible demands it.
Right.
And we can get into that whole dialogue
Right.
about what the Bible is, but for Bill, there was never any question.
Right. Well, I think that's been the strength of the journey and the vision of Bill and George, you there, George. And my last question really is to talk about today, kind of the effect of the journey's work and Bill's work on the public's opinion of the death penalty. So let's talk about that a little bit. Jack, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I can tell you essentially more of what I said before. Bill has had profound impact across this nation and around the world. I remember being with Bill, certainly in Uganda, but the story I want to tell now has to do with being attending with him a gathering of the World Congress against the death penalty in Brussels, Belgium, a year and a half ago. I was with Bill as he took me so that I could meet people on the steering committee of this organization and therefore take his place, since the sabbatical would be kicking in a few months later. So spending a week or so there in Brussels with Bill, I got to experience just how popular he was. People from a variety of countries knew him, and they would see him at the hotel or in the downtown area of Brussels, and they would call his name, Bill, Bill, so happy to see you. And he would embrace them all as if he knew them and had known them for years. And then as we walk away, he'd turn to me and say, who was that person?
That's good.
And I said to him, Bill, I don't really know, but one thing is for sure, they know you.
Oh, that's like Obama.
Yeah. That happens to so many of us.
And his story, you know, they knew him not just because of his name, but they knew him because of his story.
Yeah.
Because you don't hear that kind of story every day, a person of any kind of faith, let alone Christian faith.
Yeah, that's right.
To give someone who had committed such a horrific crime in their life. And so I said to Bill, downtown Brussels, I said, you're a star. You are a true star. Now, what I meant then was not a star in the Hollywood sense, because in many cases, the Hollywood star seeks the light to be cast on him or her. But a real star in a cosmic sense gives light to others around them. They radiate the light to all around them. And even people who are not close to them, they experience the light from a real star.
Hmm.
And that's the kind of star Bill was, a real star who was radiant with the gifts of love and compassion and forgiveness, warming and giving light to folks all around him and far beyond him. He
That's
was a
wonderful.
star. And through him and many others who told their stories, in my short time of knowing Bill, I saw lives change, and I saw people make decisions they wouldn't have made concerning the policies that keep the death penalty moving. I saw people experience some changes in how they understood those policies. And so I say to God be the glory for Bill Pelkey.
Yeah, absolutely. And George, let's go back to, and Jack just touched on it, but when we're talking about the public opinion currently of the death penalty in the U.S. and even worldwide, what do you think the impact the journey has had on that public opinion? And where do you think we are today?
Again, I've been speaking publicly for close to 30 years now. And like I said earlier, you know, when I first heard about these other murder victim family members that oppose the death penalty, I was kind of stunned. I didn't realize there were more like me.
Yes.
And I have seen the pendulum shift. I guess is a good way to see it in these past 30 years. And I feel that we with the journey play a role in that.
Absolutely.
It's all of us working together. It obviously is, and it takes all of us doing things. But Abe can quote the statistics and tell you more about that. But I have seen over the years it more and more and more people are becoming aware, people becoming educated, and it takes more education, and it's a constant battle because there's certainly setbacks, but more and more and more the message of love and compassion for all humanity is being welcomed.
Yes,
And it's
yes,
having an effect.
yes.
Uh, um, I guess that kind of
Yeah,
covers it.
and I'll let Abe, I'll let you say some things too here, but let me also say it's kind of it is a little bit repetitive, but it's the stories of crime victims and then hearing from exonerees that I think
Right.
just really changes people's hearts and minds in an incredible way. And I know that in the work that we do at Restorative Justice International, we keep pointing to those stories, and because it does change public views. What are your thoughts, Abe? Maybe you can kind of conclude on this.
Well, sure. First, I want to say that we're actually gathering people's tributes, and this program itself is a tremendous opportunity. But I'm going to send to you, and maybe you can share it when you post this. There's a web page that gives people prompts on how to submit their reflections and remembrances of Bill. And I just want to invite everybody to help us create that legacy for Bill, for both the journey of hope from violence to healing, and Bill's partner Kathy, and Bill's family. And so with that, it's often said that people will less remember what you say than how you make them feel. And and that's the impression that is really important to know. I'll tell just a quick story. There was a moment where after 9/11, when it used to be that you could travel from the United States to Canada and Mexico on a driver's license. And then after September 11th and the terrorist attack, they changed it so you had to have a passport. But there was this period in between. And the World Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty was having a conference in Montreal. And I found myself in Montreal taking the gamble that I would go there and figure out my way back into the United States, because you could still go to Canada on a driver's license, but you couldn't get back without your passport. In any case, I'm on my way back after the conference, and I get up to the U.S. Customs agent, and she says, "What were you doing in Montreal?" And I'm wearing a T-shirt that says, I'm wearing a Journey shirt now, but then I was wearing an I Oppose the Death Penalty T-shirt, and I told her I was at this conference, and why I didn't have my passport and all that, and she thinks for a moment, and then she says, do you know Bill Pelkey? And, well, as a matter of fact, I was just sleeping on the floor in his hotel room, and he was with me at this conference. And she said, "Oh, well, he spoke in my criminology class 10 years ago."
Wow.
Stamp, welcome back. And that's, that's one person, right? But one person in a criminology class. And that's the impact and the power of the Journey of Hope
Yes.
now since 1993 and even before. And not just Bill, but all these people who are storytellers who put themselves out there and tell their stories. The impact that they have, the ripples of love and compassion and forgiveness that they put into the world, there's no way to measure that impact,
Yes.
but I guarantee you it's massive.
Yes.
And that's, in no small part because of Bill Pelkey.
Absolutely, and that changes public opinion. So let's make our final comments about Bill today. And George, why don't you lead off your final comments, thinking about Bill?
Bill, as I said before, was my brother by choice. We traveled all over the world together. I shared many hotel rooms with him. I've heard him speak many hundreds of times. As long as I have breath in my body, I will miss my brother.
Absolutely. Bless your heart. Oh, George, yeah, it's such a great loss. I'm so glad that you were here to share today. And Abe, just a few comments and then we'll let Pastor Jack close us.
Sure. I'll just share that while we've been doing this, I got a text message saying that Sister Helen Prejean has agreed to come to the conference that we're doing in honor of Bill next
Wonderful.
week. Yeah, this is the program book from the first ever Journey of Hope Legacy Awards dinner, which I created as part of the Ohio Journey last year. And the back picture
Right.
is Bill with Sister Helen on
Right.
his bus, and we didn't get to talk about the bus today, but here's the message. I don't know if we can see it there. I'll read it. Oh, but it's not on this one. This is the message that obviously Bill had his, but there's a picture I have of that. But the bottom line is this: Bill was not anxious to be recognized as that. When I proposed that dinner, at first it wasn't about Bill, but I said, Bill, we need to give you a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Yes.
And he's like, I don't want any awards. And I said, Bill, it's not about you. People are going to support the journey. People are going to lift up the journey because we're recognizing you. And that was Bill Pelkey allowing himself to put himself into an uncomfortable place because he knew it was for the better good of the organization and the movement and the world.
Yeah.
And that's Bill Pelkey.
That's
and
wonderful.
Every day.
Yeah, thanks so much, Abe. And Pastor Jack, you want to end your comments here?
Sure. Our brother Bill was confident and tenacious, not in a self-centered way, but in a way that boasted his conviction, his belief in the power of love and compassion and forgiveness for all people. And because of his confidence and tenacity, he was not anxious, as Abe said. He was a man of joy, immense joy, and he shared that joy all over the world. And so what he taught me and so many others who carry out this heavy and draining work is to never lose the joy we have that comes from our convictions and the power of love, compassion, and forgiveness for all humanity. So thanks be to God for our brother and our friend, Bill Pelkey.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being a part of this today. And we just remember Bill, and we know that someday we'll see him. But God bless his memory. And this is Lisa Ray. Thank you all.
Amen.
For RJI. Thank you. And thank you, George.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
God bless.